morning to all of you. Welcome to this jointly hosted US Studies Centre and Asia Society webinar titled A New Cold War, China, America and the Geopolitics of COVID-19. We have three great expert panelists with us today to discuss a topic that I think is extremely timely and continues to unfold day by day. The first is Richard Maude. Richard joined Asia Society Australia in January 2020 as the inaugural Executive Director and Senior Fellow of the Asia Society Policy Institute. Richard most recently served as Deputy Secretary, Indo-Pacific Group at DFAT, and was previously the Director General of the Office of National Assessments. Second, we have Ashley Townshend, the Director of Foreign Policy and Defence at the United States Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with Ashley's research and commentary on strategic affairs in the Indo-Pacific region. And third, we have Dr. Lynn Kuok joining us from Singapore. Welcome, Lynn. Lynn is the Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow for Asia-Pacific Security at the International Institute for Strategic Studies and a Senior Research Fellow at the University of Cambridge. Lynn's research focus is on security and law of the Indo-Pacific, particularly the South China Sea dispute. Now on to today's topic. Even before COVID-19 emerged this year, US-China relations had already entered a competitive and I think mistrustful phase. The Trump administration, in its 2017 National Security Strategy, identified China as the principal revisionist actor in the Indo-Pacific, whose actions and policies had already challenged key aspects of the US-led order. Since then, we've seen deep differences emerge between the two countries, manifesting in the US side in a trade war, policies to decouple US economic interdependence with China in high technology in particular, a sharpening of rhetoric and action over the South China Sea disputes, as well as Beijing's management of the pandemic, China's treatment of its Uyghur population, and its enactment of a new national security law over Hong Kong. On China's side, we have seen more aggressive action in the South China Sea to coerce, intimidate, and prevent rival claimants' states from enjoying their territorial rights. Similar aggressive action on the border with India, matched with what is commonly termed wolf warrior diplomacy. The relationship between the US and China, in sum, is characterized by deep mistrust and animosity. So relations are clearly at their lowest point for many years or decades. Some are describing this as the beginning of a new Cold War. Whether this is the case or not, these fissures appear to be difficult to overcome, regardless of the outcome of this year's American presidential election. With this in mind, I want to now turn to our panelists and to ask broadly, what are the drivers behind these trends? How is this competition manifesting itself? How is our region responding? And where are US-China relations headed? So I'll start now with the first opening question that I'll direct first to you, Richard, and then turn to our other panelists. So what do you think, Richard, are the factors that are driving these developments? Why has the relationship between the US and China deteriorated further since COVID-19?
Well, thanks, Lavina, and thanks very much to US Studies Centre for partnering with the Asia Society for this event. You know, this really is the big question of our times, certainly for the world and for Australian foreign policy. There's really no bigger issue than, of course, how to manage the rise of China and also how to manage competition between China and the United States. And you could say, Lavina, that some degree of competition is the inevitable result of great powers competing, but I think that misses some important points. So just a couple of thoughts from me. One, the pandemic has certainly accelerated US-China differences, and they've added even more heat into a very difficult relationship. But it's important, I think, for us to remember that America's falling out with China has been quite long in the making. It predates President Trump. It encompasses both the Republican and Democratic parties, even if they differ in part about what to do about China. And it also encompasses much of the US business community. And there is a long answer to your question, a very long one, but the short answer to your question is that the US sees the old model of dealing with China as broken and no longer serving US interests. So that was, of course, a model of engagement and managing differences, and often managing differences down in the hope of cooperation on global challenges, and also of change and reform in China. And the US now sees itself gripped, I think, not just in competition with another big power, as I said, but with a much more authoritarian and ideological China that often breaks commitments and seeks unilateral advantage in order to sustain the party's grip on power. And I think it's really interesting to listen to what the leading foreign policy thinkers on both sides of the political in the US say about the kind of relationship they want now with China. They use words very often like more balanced, fair, and reciprocal. And those words are really important because they define what the US seeks. And in seeking those objectives, the Trump administration is much more willing to push back against China's behaviour. It's much more willing to use sticks rather than carrots, and you mentioned a lot of those sticks, and it's much more willing to tolerate a higher degree of friction in the relationship. Indeed, if you have a look at the administration's recent public document on its China strategy, one of its explicit aims is, and I'm quoting here, is to compel Beijing to cease or reduce actions harmful to the United States' national interest. So this really is a fundamental shift in US thinking about the balance of cost and benefit in the relationship. And that drives a lot of those actions that we've seen on IP theft, on mercantilist trade and investment policies, on cyber, on technology, on media. My fellow panelists and I were joking that there's an announcement, every day at the moment on many of these issues on the South China Sea, just in the last couple of days or so. And, I think clearly there's more to come. Now I'm going to stop here, Lavina, and let other panelists have a go, but obviously all of this does raise some big questions. I think one of which is, will sticks have any greater success than carrots in changing China's behaviour? What are the risks of the current strategy? And also, would things be any different under a democratic administration?
Thanks, Richard. Ashley, what are your thoughts? I mean, Richard has mentioned that it's a long-term trajectory, that it's not, we can expect to some extent that this is structural, that any time you have a rising great power and it meets an existing great power, there's going to be friction. But we're seeing that it's deteriorating quite a lot in a very short space of time. And I'm interested in your view, and also in a sense, is one side more at fault than the other? Maybe we can try and talk about that early on.
Thanks, Lavina. And again, let me just express my thanks to the Asia Society for co-hosting this great event with us, and to you, Lynn, and IISS for supporting as well. Look, maybe I might make 3 points to get rolling. And first is on the immediacy of the uptick in acrimony and in competition and in a cycle of escalation that is faster than many of us can keep up with. I don't think it was preordained that the Trump administration, or certainly an alternative US administration, but even the Trump administration had to approach COVID-19 from the lens of accelerating competition, nor did Beijing. They were choices that were made, and I think it's important to note that they were choices that were made with a lot of momentum behind them, as Richard laid out, but also choices that were made in many respects, irrespective of the concerns and interests of many other countries across the Indo-Pacific. It's certainly the case that all of us have a stake in US-China coordination, in global and regional coordination when it comes to COVID-19. And so it's at least conceivable that there were opportunities early on for China to be more transparent, for the United States to use less sort of inflammatory rhetoric in characterizing China's initial response, for the two sides to find off-ramps, as they tried on a couple of occasions earlier in the year, and but ultimately haven't pursued, and that we would have all been better off for that sort of relationship and for that sort of compromise in responding to what is ultimately a shared challenge, one that none of us have experienced before, and one which will require engagement and coordination with all countries, including the US and China, with respective regional friends, partners, and allies. So that's the first point. And so I think reflecting on why that didn't happen is really interesting. And I think that goes to the second and longer term point. Richard's laid out very well, I think, that the US-China antagonism is both structural as well as something which has had its origins in administrations, both in the Hu Jintao administration as well as in the Obama administration and earlier, and wasn't just a product of the Trump administration. I think there's still a lot of misunderstanding about that. What I think changed in the Trump administration is that there was a removal of the political filter that often constrained the kinds of public commentary and policy positions that officials or leaders in the United States system would and could take. And by that, I mean, if you had conversations with the Asia hands in the State Department during the Obama administration, or indeed with folks in the Pentagon going back even earlier than that, you would have encountered a very similar strand in thinking about the kind of threat that China posed to US interests in the Indo-Pacific, both in a military sense as well as in the sense of, let's say, a sphere of influence sense. But many of those views were restrained and calibrated by political control at the senior levels, control that didn't want the relationship to get out of hand, control that was motivated not by a sense of defeatism or capitulationism or anything like that, which is often how it's characterized retrospectively, but out of a concern to manage stability in a very important relationship, to manage all of the equities that the US has with China. Richard mentioned the business community, which at least until recently, although it's changed over time, but at least until the last 5 years, still wasn't persuaded of the kind of turn that we're seeing now in the US system. And so you had this restraining factor that the Trump administration largely removed. And I think that was a product in many ways of key personalities in that administration. And of course, of the president's own views on this and the president's own willingness to play a brinksmanship in international politics. So I think, people matter, choices could have been there. This administration has both adopted people and choices that have been less concerned by stability and by maintaining that relationship in check. I think a point to note here is why, and if we leave the president aside for a moment, it is the case that the United States public really wasn't that concerned about China as a strategic competitor until the last 4 years. If you look at public polling going back through the Obama years and even in the start of the Trump administration, China ranked very low in threat perceptions and is creeping up now. And if it is the case that there was a consensus forming over a decade, really at the elite level, that China was a competitor that needed to be responded to by the United States, and that would need to mobilize resources and change bureaucratic patterns of behavior in order to focus attention on that challenge, then you see part of the domestic political logic for taking a more strident, in many cases assertive stand rhetorically in characterizing that relationship and removing that political filter. So I think that that's one of the drivers of that relationship. Lavina, that doesn't get to your third point, which is about blame. And I don't think that that's necessarily one that we can answer. And I think the reasons for that are that we can go back to any point on the calendar in the last 30 years, until to the mid-90s, I would say, at least, and point to tit-for-tat cycles between the US and China that have blown out over time. One of the ones that's most often pointed to is the way that China has modernized its military since the mid-90s, when it became acutely aware of the way that the United States' capacity to wage, precision strike warfare against competitors, or at least against smaller states in Europe and the Middle East, could well be mobilized against it in a Taiwan Straits contingency, and has methodically set about doing something about that. I think the real question that's interesting for us to answer is, why has it taken so long for the United States to respond to that kind of challenge? And noting that it has taken so long, I think the urgency with responding and shifting policy settings quickly, in part, is why we've seen and experienced a bit of whiplash in this administration.
Oh gosh.
Looks like, Lavina, you might have frozen. Lynn, I can see you haven't frozen, and I know she was coming to you. So why don't we just turn to you and keep the conversation rolling?
Sure. Thank you so much. I'd just like to, Lavina, we've just...
you lost me. I'm back again. Sorry.
Welcome back. First of all, let me start off by thanking the US Studies Centre, as well as the Asia Society Australia, for the invitation to join in this discussion today. I think your Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, recently said that, the region is becoming, or the world is becoming, poorer, more dangerous and disorderly. And if that's the case, I think Australia is very fortunate to have scholars like you to be looking and thinking about these issues. I'm very grateful to be part of the conversation today, so thank you for having me on. In response to the question of, why the relations between the United States and China are deteriorating, I think, as has been said by Richard and Ashley, these COVID-19 was merely the accelerant of an already deteriorating relationship. I think what is happening, I'll state my argument up front and then kind of elaborate on it, is that relations have become so bad because increasingly we are seeing US goals come onto the horizon, which are fundamentally inconsistent with Chinese goals that have always been on the horizon, even though they may not have been acted upon. So if we look at the various disputes, if there's an important dispute, there's a US-China element to it currently. So basically, whether it's trade or technology or the South China Sea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, there's this US-China angle to all of this. And it's, in a sense, these are because these are disputes that are important, and just the number and the scope of these arguments are enough to increase tension in any relationship. But I think it's more fundamental than that. These disputes are, in a sense, the symptoms rather than the cause of this breakdown between the United States and China, which has at its heart, I think, a deep strategic distrust of the other party, and a fundamental anxiety about the other party's anxieties. Now, we've seen that in the United States, which has in various policy documents labeled China as its main strategic competitor, the 2017 National Security Strategy, the 2018 National Defense Strategy, the 2019 report on the Chinese military. And I think if we look at all of these, we see an increasing sense of concern over China as a dangerous player. And while US goals were initially unclear, I think what seems to be clearer by its words and rhetoric, even though the United States might not be aware of it themselves, is that it's even moving beyond what Richard mentioned earlier about seeking a more balanced, fair, and reciprocal relationship with China. I think at its root, the United States is worried about China surpassing it in the region, and it's hoping to block that. China, on its part, I think, has always had a belief that the United States seeks to constrain its rise and wants to continue with its regional hegemony. I think the Trump administration's actions have largely reinforced those views, but these views have been present, I would suggest, for decades. If we look at the 1996-1997 Taiwan Straits crisis, I think if we look at modern history, it might have begun there, and followed by the 1999 US bombing of the Chinese embassy in Serbia, George W. Bush's labeling of China as a strategic competitor in 2001, followed by the EP3 incident in 2001, where US signals intelligence aircraft collided with a Chinese fighter aircraft near Hainan Island. And then Hillary Clinton's throwing the United States hat in the ring in the South China Sea by stating that the United States has interests in the freedom of navigation, open access to Asia's maritime commons, and respect for international law in the South China Sea. Now, China is likely, as I mentioned earlier, always to have excluding the United States from what it considers its sphere of influence. But I think what changed in recent years has been the fact that now it considers in recent years it's considered the challenges posed by the United States as decreased, and China's strengths, both economically as well as militarily, to have increased, and that's why it started taking actions most dramatically, I think, in the South China Sea with its, almost conjuring up overnight of, huge artificial islands, which are now serving as basically military bases for China. So I think, in short, then I think the cause of deteriorating U.S. relations with China is these fundamentally inconsistent goals of, seeking to exclude each other from what they consider their sphere of influence, and the deep distrust on both sides.
Thank you. I think all of you have kind of raised some issues related to this almost conceptualization of what's going on as a new Cold War. And I know that's part of the title of this event. And I wanted all of you to just consider that for a moment. I mean, it's quite a debate within international relations circles as to whether it's actually useful to think about what's emerging now as being apt as a Cold War description, or whether it's actually very distinct and that we really can't turn back time and it's not a useful analogy. So I think I wanted to, I won't go all together in the same order, but I might ask Richard first to give Lynn a break, and then I'll come back to you, Lynn. Richard, what do you think about that?
Sure, thanks, Lavina. Well, it's certainly true that the historians and the policy wonks and the strategists are working themselves up to have a big fight about whether or not we should use that term. And at some point, of course, that becomes a bit pointless. And so we should be careful not to get lost in that debate. I do think it's an imperfect analogy. I don't think this is a rerun of the Russia-US Cold War. I do think there are some big differences. One is, for example, that the US and the Chinese economies are deeply entangled. And even though I think we are going to see some partial decoupling in some areas, particularly technology, obviously, I don't see any grand decoupling of their economies. I think that's a fantasy. And I don't think really that American business wants that at all. I also think that the contest with China is a much more multipolar one, and will increasingly be so into the future. It's not just about China and America, it's also about Japan and India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Australia, and even Europe, of course, where there's a reinvigorated debate about how to manage the differences with China. I think whatever you call it, there are some things we should clear about. One is that the competition is multifaceted, so it's economic, it's technological, it's strategic. It does have a quite strong ideological component to it, and it's also global in its dimensions. So whatever you call it, it is a very big challenge for us all to manage, and built into it, of course, are some clear risks that we also need to do our best to manage.
Okay, Lynn, what do you think? Is the Cold War analogy an apt one, or as Richard has pointed out, there's some really quite important differences?
Well, I think the limits to the term Cold War are quite clear to me, and some of them have been highlighted as well to Richard. But let me say this. It is a Cold War that we're now embarking upon between the United States and China, in the sense that it is a heightened state of geopolitical competition between the two great powers that's short of a kinetic or a hot war. So in that very limited respect, we are entering a Cold War. And I think there was a concession of that, without perhaps those same words, by Foreign Minister Wang Yi in a statement, I think it was last week, when he talked about relations being at the worst point between the United States and China since they reestablished ties 4 decades ago. So yes, Cold War, because it's not a hot war. But I think, like Richard, I find the analogy very not terribly helpful. Analogies are usually meant for clarification and to make an argument of sorts. I find it the debate around it rather confused and confusing. If the argument is that the United States will ultimately prevail in this fight against China, as it did in the Cold War, then I think this argument is clearly stretching it, because, as Richard mentioned, there are clear distinctions between what happened during that Cold War and what's happening today. The first difference that comes to everyone's mind, of course, and that was already mentioned, is that the US and Chinese economies are far more integrated. You can decouple in some areas, but not across the board without huge costs. And I think this point is significant because, yes, there can be decoupling across a wide arena of issues, but this is going to hurt the United States as much, possibly even more, than than China. So in this respect, both parties, if they sought to decouple their economies, they are going to be cutting off their noses to spite their faces. So that's not going to work. The second difference, I think, in my view, that's significant, is that China is economically much stronger than the Soviet Union was during the Cold War. So it is the second largest economy in the world. And in terms of purchasing power parity, that China surpassed the United States in 2014. While COVID-19, I think, will hurt China's growth trajectory, I think all signs are that it's likely to also be hurting the United States and its allies as much, if not more. The third reason I think that this analogy is flawed is that the countries over which China and the United States and its allies seek influence over today are quite different from, they're in quite a different position from the position during the Cold War. So they are not easily going to be swayed to fall in line between blocs. They are resisting, as we've seen, having to make a choice between the United States and China. So quite a different set of scenarios. And I think, quite apart from the Cold War analogy not being terribly analytically useful, I think it might also be dangerous insofar as it overemphasizes the role of ideology in this fight between the United States and China. I think ideology has a fairly limited role to play, has had a fairly limited role so far, insofar as it influences threat perceptions on both sides. But I don't think China, thus far at least, is seeking to actively export its Leninist ideology. And there's frankly very little appetite in the region for this. I think countries are attracted by the China model simply because it's an economic power, and they're interested in its economic offerings. Now, if the United States starts becoming too evangelical about democracy and about political regimes, and I see signs of that happening, then what we might see is, first, we might see further divisions entrenched between the United States and China, making the relationship even more intractable and causing even more instability. And second, I don't think it works well for the United States because it might limit the number of partners that the United States can usefully work with. Because if you think about it, very few countries in the world, not very few, but the vast majority of countries in the world are not liberal, countries in the world are not, especially in the region, are not liberal democracies. And this will in turn leave a vacuum for China to play in to influence these countries. And I think this could result in the very result that proponents of a more ideological stance are seeking, namely the reversal of democratic gains in the region. So for those three reasons, namely deepening divisions, limiting partnerships, as well as possibly having the unintended consequence of reversing democratic gains in the region by opening the strategic field to China, I think we need to avoid casting the debate so much as an ideological debate, I think, the ideological battle. And I think that Cold War illusions actually militate against this, are not helpful in this respect.
Okay, and Ashley, turning to you, maybe this is a little bit of a segue to another question I wanted to ask about wolf warrior diplomacy. So Lynn's raised, and both Richard and Lynn have raised some very important points about differences between what happened in the Cold War and what's happening now. But I wanted to maybe ask you a little bit about the idea of ideology and the role of ideology. There are some that would argue that it is actually about the differences in ideology and political system that might have been driving what's going on now. And when you look at some aspects of wolf warrior diplomacy that we see emerging this year, some aspect of that is also about saying that the Chinese system is a better system in dealing with pandemics, things that require control of population in the most efficient way. What do you think about that role of kind of promoting the political system of the Chinese government, as well as whether wolf warrior diplomacy, what's driving this wolf warrior diplomacy? Is it about insecurity, or is it about actually propelling some strategic interests? I'll leave that to you.
Thanks, Lavina. Let me make one very quick point about the Cold War, and I'll come to that question. And that's simply to say I agree with Richard and Lynn that the characterization is imperfect. I would go one step further and say that the challenge that we have in dealing with China is much harder than the challenge in many ways that the US and Europe and the world had in dealing with the Soviet Union, for two reasons. And one of those is that the Soviet Union was granted a sphere of influence at the end of the Second World War. What we are witnessing in the Indo-Pacific is a China that's seeking to acquire a sphere of influence, and countries like Australia, Japan, India, the United States, others in the region to a greater or lesser degree, are trying to do more to stop that than they have previously. But the power imbalance that presents us, and the lack of coordination because of a clear organizing principle of ideology that presents us, makes it a harder challenge. That, coupled with Richard's points that this is a multipolar competition, I think could be read, it could be interpreted in two ways. On the one hand, there's more actors than the US and China. There are more balances out there. But the flip side of that is the US organized, if you like, the Cold War response, in part because it possessed 60% of world GDP at the time. Now it possesses 20% of world GDP. And so the equities in decision-making and the preferences of regional countries, which are not aligned in as uniform a way, all need to be taken into account to a much greater degree in order to organize a similar response. I think that's a good segue to the role of ideology, because again, although we could quibble at this and should at the margins, by and large there was a clear ideological framework for organizing the US-Soviet, US or West and Eastern competition during the Cold War that is lacking today. I share Lynn's point, Lynn's view rather, that an increasingly ideological and political systems focus by the US or any countries that are US allies has very clear risks attached to it because of the way that countries are both unable to, even if they wanted to, adopt that similar position because of their dependencies in other domains on China in ways that are not going to be decoupled, or because the nature of their regime, of the regime, the third-party regime itself, is not a democracy and is yet a strategically useful country for the US to be pursuing greater alignment with in the region. And so for those two reasons, just for starters, ideology is not going to be the organizing principle. But we are seeing the US adopt a more ideological framework, at least in rhetoric. I think the new White House China strategy is a very good example of that, as are speeches made by Mike Pence, Pompeo recently, the Secretary of State, that also play on the importance of US values, the championing of values, freedom and openness, respect for sovereignty and non-interference, all of these things which of course are easy to agree with, but not necessarily the lens with which it is the most effective way to galvanize alignment patterns in the region. The wolf warrior diplomacy side of the spectrum, if you like, is a sort of more aggressive and maybe more ham-fisted in a way mirror image by China seeking to aggressively portray its system as better in handling the pandemic response may, in some technical senses, have some merit, but obviously doesn't overcome the heart of the issue, which is that they hid from world scrutiny the initial outbreak and responses to it. So it's a fairly thin platform to stand on. But beyond that, where wolf warrior diplomacy has moved from just defending the Chinese system, which, if you like, was the bread and butter of Chinese propaganda for many years when it came to these sorts of big global issues, it's moved from that to actually trying to criticize other countries, to sow dissent within them, to sow uncertainty about what's actually happened, criticizing French responses to the pandemic, accusing French nurses of taking racist stances, inflaming rhetoric in different countries through Europe, through the region, when it comes to the validity of those statements, using a lot of false narratives that are actually patently untrue and have been shown to be so with regards to the origin of COVID-19 being a US Marine Corps visit to China earlier in the year, or late last year rather, when it comes to the way that countries have responded. There is a lot of misinformation out there. I think a lot of that has been strategically motivated, but has not succeeded. It's been strategically motivated because in addition to just trying to defend and advance their position as a state that is more competent in dealing with this for the attendant effects that would have, it's also been motivated, at least in the Australian case, to try to split Australia or to sow doubt around the reasons for Australia's own efforts to stand up a COVID-19 inquiry, to sow doubt around that particular policy priority, which is not in Beijing's interests, and also to try and split us from the United States in finding common positions. That splitting of allies has been a key objective of Chinese propaganda and carries through into wolf warrior diplomacy.
Now, Richard, what is your take on the objectives of this wolf warrior diplomacy? Do you see some clear objectives? I know Ashley's answer was very comprehensive. Not sure how much room he's left you, but do you think it's actually achieving those objectives, or in fact detracting from what China might be seeking to achieve?
Well, I think from when we look at out on the world, it looks pretty counterproductive. In fact, it looks mostly almost entirely counterproductive. And of course, a lot of people, even people who watch China closely, have been scratching their heads about this. How can it be in China's long-term interest to so alienate so many of its partners? I mean, they've even managed to alienate parts of Europe, and that really takes some doing. So, and you know, there is a little bit of a debate, as much as you can have a debate in China these days about this. There are a few brave voices who've said, well, what is going on here? And it is actually really hard to know why. Some people who know China very well, you know, essentially say it's about perception of not not being seen at home in China to be backing down, that China has to take the fight on this issue to the world, and that China is now powerful enough to do so. And look, that's quite a plausible explanation. Another one might be that the system that Xi Jinping built is pretty rigid these days, and when a general instruction comes down to be more aggressive in your diplomacy, which is actually what the Chinese Foreign Ministry was instructed to do, everybody really gets the instruction, and so they're all out there going their hardest and seeing what their fellow ambassadors are doing around the world. But the short answer is, I think it's been highly counterproductive for them. I'm going to give you 2 cents on ideology, though. Okay. We shouldn't get lost in this either, but it's a fantastic, important subject. I think Lynn is right that China is not really trying to export its model of governance. I don't think it really expects its neighbours to become, to create communist parties and run themselves like China. But I do think ideology is really a really important part of the problem we have with China at the moment for a couple of reasons. One is the party now places this enormous emphasis on ideological security and purity, and they see this as the key to preserving the party within China. And of course, now that has an enormous extraterritorial reach to it. And this is one of the big rub points in the relationship. The misinformation campaigns, the foreign interference, the reaching into countries like Australia and America to try and shape debate, to control the narrative, to influence Chinese communities, overseas Chinese communities. And this is undeniably one of the big friction points we have with China at the moment. And the second point about ideology is, while China doesn't really expect the world to become like it, it's certainly interested in reshaping parts of the global system so that it's more accommodative of China's interests and its form of government. I could go on a lot, but I'm going to stop.
Thank you. Lynn, I'm going to bring you in there, not necessarily to talk about wolf warrior diplomacy, but I'm actually interested in talking a little bit about the region and bringing in your expertise about the region. Part of that is wolf warrior diplomacy and what effect that is having, because we see that China is also pressuring a lot of Southeast Asian countries to be very grateful for their health, equipment and any assistance that they're giving. So it's the flip side to the more coercive aspects of wolf warrior diplomacy is also that, again, what you just said, Richard, that construction of the narrative about, this is why China in the region is a good thing, and here's a concrete example of what China can do for these smaller countries. I also wanted to bring in more generally, so we're talking about US-China and how it's playing out in the region and affecting the strategies of Indo-Pacific countries, particularly Southeast Asia. And I've got a question from John Lee in the audience listening, and he asked, I think, an important question about hedging strategies. So we know that Southeast Asian countries have a hedging strategy when it comes to the US and China. They want to benefit from both countries and they don't want to be forced to choose. And he has asked here that Southeast Asian countries often argue that they shouldn't be forced to choose, whilst in the meantime, countries like the Quad countries making their own arrangements. They're taking active steps to counter some of the more adverse aspects of Chinese policies. And has this fence sitting been detrimental to both ASEAN and the ability of Southeast Asian states to shape the agenda? What's your view on how this is playing out?
Thank you. Let me address those questions in turn. So the effectiveness of wolf warrior diplomacy in Southeast Asia, I think I would broadly agree with what Ashley and Richard have said, namely that, it's been counterproductive. It's been rather obnoxious and off-putting, but I don't think that, the the region necessarily or the international audience was the target of Chinese World War diplomacy. It was a domestic message meant to assert the primacy of China's, or the efficiency of China's response over others. That said, while it wasn't helpful, I don't think it's going to have long-lasting negative implications, at least in Southeast Asia. I think it's a blip in the ocean. Countries in the region are going to be making their decisions based on determinations of national interests. And as off-putting as Chinese diplomacy might have been through the COVID-19 crisis, that's probably not going to factor in dramatically into their decision-making process. I think they're going to be looking at broader factors. So how China behaves in the South China Sea and elsewhere. So how it behaves in Hong Kong, how it behaves in Taiwan. These are all important factors that the region will be looking to factor in, looking at. And the second factor I think they will be looking at is the United States and its ability, its reliability as an ally and partner, as well as its ability to frame the issue as one that is about, as Ashley mentioned earlier, about defending a free and open Pacific. So values-based, not necessarily democracy, but the values of the rule of law, the importance of the rule of law, freedom of navigation, the peaceful resolution of disputes. So can the United States frame that as what's at stake as opposed to an anti-China coalition? And I think the third factor that they'll be looking at is the ability of the United States and middle powers like Japan, importantly Australia as well, to offer alternatives to or complements to the Belt and Road Initiative, because particularly after COVID, countries in the region are going to be looking to rebuild, they're going to be looking to develop, and infrastructure is going to be critical, and health infrastructure is going to be critical in this respect. And I think we should all be noting that Xi Jinping has already talked up a health Silk Road. So I think as countries like Japan and Australia think about how to move forward in terms of shaping the region, the importance of the health sector and securing health supplies, etc., that needs to be seriously looked into. Japan, Australia, the United States, they have a trilateral partnership infrastructure investment agreement or something. I can't remember the exact title, but I haven't seen very much movement in that respect, and urgent attention needs to be cast in that direction.
So Lynn, just to clarify from you, do you see that there's really you can't really see that any particular Southeast Asian state has shifted its position in terms of its hedging? It isn't looking at either country, the United States or China, differently in a significant way, or it's still in play?
That's not exactly what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that wolf warrior diplomacy as a factor, I don't think it's going to be significant in terms of the long-term strategic development of the country. What I think are going to be factors are the factors I just outlined, namely, how China behaves, how the United States behaves, and the ability to offer up material alternatives to the Belt and Road. So I think those are the more important issues that we need to be looking at. That said, I think it's absolutely right what John Lee mentioned, and thank you, John, for that question about Southeast Asian countries continuing to hedge. And I think while they continue to hedge, I think what we have, at least my reading of it is, though many might not agree, is that within this hedging strategy, I think there has been a slight tilt towards China. And I think China and COVID, I think, would have enhanced that slight tilt towards China. So an increasing tilt towards China within the broader hedging strategy of seeking good relations between the United States and China. And why do I say that? First, I think countries will be looking to rebuild their economies. So countries even before COVID-19 were looking towards China's Belt and Road Initiative with great interest, even though they might have disagreed on some onerous terms and wary of China's intentions, but by and large, they welcome BRI projects which might be economically viable and add something to their economy. And these are the more enlightened governments in the region, as opposed to the more corrupt ones who welcome it anyway because it helps to line their pockets. So I think we will definitely see countries like Cambodia, Laos continue to lean on China, given their the closeness of their two economies. But if we look at countries like Indonesia, for instance, Indonesia went to China offering up $91 billion worth of infrastructure projects pre-COVID-19. Post-COVID-19, we've seen Indonesia already during COVID-19 suffer the worst mortality rates. It could suffer a whole lot more. So post-COVID-19, I expect it to seek to enhance economic ties with China further, despite problems in the security realm. So despite its overlapping claims, maritime claims. Malaysia as well. The current Malaysian government, lacks legitimacy. There's plenty of infighting, and prior even to COVID, Malaysia's economy was struggling. We're going to see this government, which already had close ties with China prior to May 2018 when it lost power. We're going to see this government seek to enhance ties with China, because it's already working very closely with China in terms of a COVID response. So I think there's this tilt definitely towards China, at least with some countries in Southeast Asia. As for whether or not Southeast Asia's failure to take sides actually hurts its ability to shape the region. So thank you again, John, for that question. I think it does to a certain extent, and I think that they are trying to get more into the game of shaping developments in the region, and we saw that attempt with its issuance of the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific in the summer of 2019. That sought to, reference the Indo-Pacific, so actually use Indo-Pacific terminology, which of course the United States and its allies prefer, while at the same time, mentioning the importance of infrastructure development in the region. It didn't talk about the Quad, but it did talk about, which of course China does not like, but it did talk about the importance of economic integration and connectivity in the region. It tried to reassert ASEAN centrality and the importance of international law and the rules-based order. So it sought to balance, even as it sought to give its view, its outlook on the Indo-Pacific. So it's trying to stay in the game by, I think, trying to shape the Indo-Pacific strategy or vision as something that is about the importance of the rule of law, the rules-based order, etc., as opposed to something that is about containing China or seeks to take sides. But I think ultimately, the proof will be in the pudding as to whether or not it is able to shape developments, because it's not only words that matter, but actions as well. And I think the true test, the ultimate test, will be in whether or not ASEAN and its member states will be willing to perhaps pay a price to ensure that the rules that they hold dear are maintained, so that in the long term, even though they might suffer some short-term economic consequences, they are put on a more stable foundation for future economic growth and stability.
Thanks, Lynn. I think this we've got about 5 minutes, I think, left. So I want to bring in Richard and Ashley. We really need to also talk about Australia and how Australia fits in with this growing competition between the US and China. And I wanted to ask if either of you would like to leave some concluding thoughts. I think what Lynn just raised about the fact that Southeast Asian countries might be in fact tilting towards China, or there's opportunities for China to capitalize on weaknesses that will definitely emerge from COVID-19. What do you think in terms of how Australia should best advance its interests amid this growing competition? Could I ask Richard first to give your thoughts, and then I'll ask Ashley next.
Thanks, Lavina. So there's a few things that we are already doing because Australian policy, of course, has evolved quite a lot in recent years, and that we should keep doing. There's probably a couple of things that we're not doing that we might think about. And really, we've got a kind of three-part policy. One is that we're hardening ourselves domestically against some particular threats to security and sovereignty that China poses. So you see that in 5G, foreign investment, cyber, and so on. And we're just going to have to keep doing that, even though China doesn't like it, because those threats are real and they're significant enough that we just can't simply ignore them. Second, we have to keep working with other countries in the region, not to contain China, that would be folly, but to balance its power in the region and help support the resilience and sovereignty of key partners who are feeling the same kind of pressure. And I think our goal here is accepting that China's influence is going to grow in the region. We can live with that. What we don't want is a region that has a might is right culture or a Beijing-centric regional order in which countries are forced to defer to China's interests and authority. I think we've got a reasonable chance to achieve that. I accept what Lynn is saying about the economic lure of China, particularly for Southeast Asia, and the reluctance to choose. But equally, I see a reluctance to choose as really being about wanting to stay in the middle. And we're also seeing, I think, greater signs of a loose coalition of countries in the Indo-Pacific who want to work together to balance China's power. And then the third thing, we have to work very hard on both China and Washington. For Australian perspective, we have to be clear that the relationship is not going to work on the terms that China currently is seeking to set. We've got to pick our fights carefully, but be prepared to pay an economic cost when it's important enough. But we shouldn't close off opportunities for working with China where there are benefits to this. And then on the US, we don't have time for this, but there are some risks and problems with the current US strategy, even though it's responding to behaviours that really do damage its interests. And so what we want is to encourage the US to respond to China's challenge in a proportionate way. There have to be enough off-ramps and flexibility in its strategy to de-escalate. And we really need to find some space for the US and China to continue to be able to work together on big global challenges that really matter, like climate change.
And Ashley, probably 2 minutes.
Thanks, Lavina. I will be very brief. Look, I agree with the points Richard just made. I'll make two brief ones. First is, I think, when it comes to accepting a degree of cost, as Lynn said, if we are to move from hedging to doing something about the predicament, Australia has in many ways led the way there over the last few years. Richard just alluded to that. And I don't think that is something that is going to shift quickly. We've paid a cost for our response to disinformation recently. We've paid a cost to our response to stand up for something that was, if you like, order reinforcing, that is to say the COVID-19 inquiry. Those are calculated costs made at very senior levels, and I think should also signal to the region that there is in Australia a willingness to not only seek in words to preserve a regional order, but to actually undertake deeds, including with others, that will help to reinforce that. That's the second point. We've just had the defence update released a fortnight ago. And the first part of that, and probably the under-emphasised part of that in terms of its reporting, is the shaping role for Australian defence diplomacy in the Australian Defence Department. Shaping the region in ways that will be conducive to finding those balances, those common interests, those situations of strength that help regional countries to help themselves, to the regional countries that are on the front line of Chinese coercion, to help them ensure their sovereignty, share intelligence, partner with them in a defence sense, partner more broadly in a capacity building sense when it comes to institutional resilience, counter foreign interference, etc., legislation, those sorts of things. They are the work agenda for not just Australia, but for the US, for Japan, for others in the region. It's already underway, and I think it's only through doing that that you will be in a position where the nature of the regional strategic environment will be still conducive to the interests and values that we hold most dear.
Well, thank you. Lynn, did you want to, I think we've got no time actually, but if there's anything you want to say right at the end here before I close up.
Well, I had several things to say, but I think I'll just leave it at one. I think we're not going to see US-China competition go away. So the off-ramps that Richard talked about are highly important. I think what should be the international community's main goals, and also the regional countries, their main goal should be twofold. So they should be looking at ensuring that competition takes place within bounds, within a wider framework, within which very fierce competition can actually take place safely. So one, they need to ensure that a rules-based order is maintained, defended, and adhered to. And two, it needs to ensure that multilateral institutions are fit for purpose, so that however fierce competition is between the two great powers, we have certain checks in place. And I think that in the nearer term, I think, is what we should all be looking towards doing.
Thank you. So I want to thank all of you for sharing your really great insights on this very big topic, important topic. So thank you, Richard, Maude, Ashley Townshend, and Lynn Kuok. And I now wanted to just briefly show the audience some important pieces of research that all of the participants in the panel today have recently written that you might like to look up and read further. So we have a report by Ashley Townshend, Brendan Thomas Noon, and Matilda Stewart called Bolstering Resilience in the Indo-Pacific. We have a piece by Richard Maude, Looking Ahead, Australia and China After the Pandemic, all very relevant to what we've talked today. And on the next slide, we have a very interesting blog by Lynn Kuok, Will COVID-19 Change the Geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific? And lastly, a paper that I've written for the Lowy Institute on the Quad and how the Quad might fit in with the geostrategic competition between US and China. Now I'd like to turn to Ashley. Ashley, over to you.
Oh, thanks, Lavina. Thank you very much for moderating. Great discussion today. I'll be brief here, but just a quick plug that next Wednesday, the US Study Center will be running a webinar with those you can see on the screen, moderated by our CEO, Simon Jackman, that will foreshadow a little bit of the discussion for the upcoming US-Australia-AUSMIN consultations, and where we'll discuss the report Bolstering Resilience in the Indo-Pacific that you just mentioned.
And Richard?
Thanks, Lavina. I don't know whether that slide's going to come up, but I was going to plug an Asia Society event. There it is. On the need for a green recovery in Asia with one of my colleagues at the Australian arm of the Asia Society Policy Institute, Patrick Suckling. Can I thank you and my fellow panelists? Particularly great to have Lynn here because it's really good to have a perspective directly from the region. Also wanted to recognise we had a hell of a lot of really good questions. I was trying to type answers to some of them, but my fingers weren't fast enough. And the questions, I think, go to the complexity of and the importance of this set of issues for Australian foreign policy. So maybe at some other point we can come back and tease some of them more out. Thanks very much.
So thank you all again, and thank you all in the audience for joining us today. I hope you found it really interesting, and that you'll join us for all of those further events coming up. And thanks again, Lynn, and the Asia Society and the US Study Center.